My book makes really two arguments. The one has to do with Lincoln and emancipation and how the Lincoln administration sought to teach the Union soldiers that they needed to fight in a war for emancipation. And so I have two chapters in the book that look at that period from basically January through March '63. And what I argue is that the Lincoln administration very diligently worked to teach the soldiers that they needed to fight for emancipation. And it did so by court-martialing soldiers or summarily dismissing soldiers and officers who spoke out against emancipation. And that this had a really effective, it was a really effective approach in terms of teaching the Union Army that they needed to support Lincoln's war policies. And then what I do is I transition to the election of 1864. Now, 78% of the soldiers voted for Lincoln, and most scholars have looked at that statistic and said, well, it's very obvious that the soldiers supported Lincoln, and since Lincoln was running on a platform that pledged emancipation, or pledged the 13th Amendment, that they supported emancipation as well. And what I've tried to do is dig a little bit deeper than just that basic statistic and look at what the election meant to soldiers. And I found a whole lot of things that scholars have never really looked at before. I found an incredible amount of intimidation and fraud in terms of how Democrats in the Army were dealt with during the campaign, with numbers of Democrats being court-martialed for speaking out against emancipation again or speaking out against Lincoln's re-election. I found dozens and dozens of officers who were dismissed from the Army in 1864 because Stanton saw them as Democrats and wanted to get rid of them. And that had an effect. It caused other officers to realize, maybe I should keep my mouth shut about these political issues rather than, speak out in favor of McClellan. And one thing that I looked at was voter turnout in the election. And in particular, I looked at what we might today call the off-year elections. The election calendar in the 19th century was very different from the way it is today. Today, all of most of our state and local and federal elections are all held on the same day. And it didn't work that way in the 19th century. You had elections in September, you had elections in October, you had elections in November. And so what I did was I looked at how soldiers voted and how civilians voted in those September, October, and November elections, and then compared it with how soldiers voted and how civilians voted in the presidential election. And what I found was the home vote for both Republicans and Democrats increased by precisely between 8 and 9%. So there was a very small uptick in the number of voters when they're voting for state level and congressional candidates for both parties. The Republican soldier vote increased by 37%, and the Democratic soldier vote increased by 97%. And I think that this shows you that the soldiers were not as tied to the political parties as most scholars have assumed that they were, but they were willing to vote for the candidate that they believed would save the Union. And so ultimately, I think these soldiers are voting for preservation of the Union rather primarily than emancipation.